Folks, very good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. I'm having a very interesting conversation here with Mark Ireland. Now, Mark, you and I have known each other for many, many years, actually. We go back quite a long way, but people watching might not be familiar with who you are and what do you do. Can you just in a sentence tell us where you are, what you do, and how you've ended up there?
I still think of you, Ian, as 35 years ago, really, when you and I were leading house parties and doing talks. And I can still remember a talk you gave on the Second Coming all those years ago. So
that's fantastic. That's very flattering. Thank you, Mark. But where are you now?
So I now live in Blackburn, and I'm Archdeacon of Blackburn. And
Right.
Blackburn is the town where the cathedral where I was ordained. Back in 1984, and I've served in Lancashire. Then I went away to Lichfield Diocese, and I was diocesan missioner and an incumbent again. And then about 6.5 years ago, I came back to Blackburn, and I'm now living 2 miles down the road from the church where I used to be curate back in the day.
So you've come full circle then.
I have.
Now, Mark, the reason why we're talking is because you have just published or just written a Grove Ethics booklet, have you not?
I have, and I have it here in front of me.
Fantastic. And I'm looking at the title, Surveillance Capitalism and the Loving Gaze of God. Now, surveillance capitalism, we'll come on to explore exactly what you mean by that. But can you just say a bit, what sort of hooked your interest in this whole subject?
Well, I suppose several things really. One is that, like all clergy, during the lockdown, we've all had to use the internet far more than we ever did before. We discovered skills in how to edit and upload and publish things that we had never learnt before. But it's also been an interest over the years. Both you hear Christians who are very excited about science and all the potential of computers and the internet is going to solve all our problems. And you also speak to Christians who are really quite concerned about the impact of the internet and its potential for evil. And rather than wanting to jump on one side or the other of that argument, I thought I'd really love to unpack that and try and reflect on that from a Christian perspective. And then I was listening to a discussion on Radio 4 in the car, going off to some meeting, about a rather hefty tome called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, and which had quite an impact 2 years ago when it came out. And that made me read this fairly hefty tome and thought, well, what are Christians thinking about this? And I couldn't find very much. So I thought, I'll write something.
So this is actually this booklet has been quite a while in the gestation. You've obviously been doing quite a lot of research and reading and thinking about it.
Well, I have really, and it's really good sometimes to have a target, because you know how it is with a sermon. Sometimes when somebody gives you a really difficult topic, you think, oh yeah, I'd like to do that because I'd like to know what I think about that subject. And then the week before, of course, you think, oh no, why did I choose such a difficult subject? But this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and then the opportunity to write something, I thought, well, that'll actually really formulate my thinking and give me a chance to engage. And really the privilege of writing a Grove booklet, and this is a little plug for Grove Books, it's given me the opportunity to engage with one or two really sharp minds in the whole area who've been just so interesting to work with. And I've really enjoyed the process, and I feel I've learned a lot. And I hope others might learn something from it.
Yeah, fabulous. Now, you begin off in your booklet in the first chapter. You begin with some slightly startling statistics. I mean, the booklet isn't full of statistics, but when you do quote things, I have to say, when I read through, I thought they were really pretty shocking. I mean, just in the first chapter on page 3, you talk about the fact that Amazon now accounts for 70% of online sales in the States, and that the Google search engine captures 90% of searches worldwide. And that 63% of the searches on Google end up on a page controlled by Google. Now, that's all part of this thing that, you know, as somebody once said, you know, if you get something for free, then you realize that you're the product. And what you set out there is the way that effectively the tables have been turned on us. We thought when the internet first came on, we thought, what a great thing. This is going to be a real help to us. We're getting something wonderful for nothing. But then it turns out that, in fact, we are the product. How has that ended up? And how does that set up the whole discussion about surveillance capitalism?
Well, in a sense, when the internet started, Google was a startup with a group of bright young people, and they created this wonderful search engine that lots of us have used. but then they couldn't find a way to make money out of it, and they tried to franchise it to Microsoft and other producers of computers, and that didn't work. Until suddenly they realized that they were absorbing a whole amount of information from everybody who did a search on Google, and telling them all about their particular interests, all about the things that good and bad that was important to them, and that information was of value. Each little bit of information is neither here nor there, but the sheer quantity of information, the sheer number of data points about our commercial history, and then of course with Facebook, the like button, which we rather enjoy because it gives us a chance to comment on other people, is fascinating from the advertiser's point of view, because they know exactly what we like and don't like in terms of politics, religion, walking trousers. You show interest in possibly buying a pair of walking trousers, and you get inundated for weeks afterwards, whatever. And now it's become so much more sophisticated that you can walk past a clothes shop, and that company will then ping an advert to your phone, provided you've given them all location services. And you might think, I haven't done that. But all of us every day tick little boxes to say terms and conditions when you go on a website, and you find, or with an app, and you find that actually you've given all your data to huge numbers of companies, and cookies are tracking what you're doing. And frankly, if we read all the terms and conditions every day in front of us, we'd never get anywhere. So we take it on trust. But actually, I believe that these big companies are abusing that trust.
Now, it's very interesting. I hadn't quite twigged, as you said, that the whole origins of Google were in this question: how do we make money out of it? And I suppose that's the power of this term, surveillance capitalism. So on the one hand, I suppose I'd always thought the term was really about saying, well, as people are watching what I'm doing, then it becomes part of the sort of capital system. But in fact, you're saying that the fundamental origin of this whole thing was in a desire to say, well, how do we make money out of this? And I seem to remember people saying, number one, Facebook would never make any money, and also people said that Amazon would never make any money. People thought that in the early days that Bezos was absolutely crazy, thinking, how are you ever going to actually make margins on the show? But actually, they've done exactly that.
Well, surveillance is really the price we pay for having the internet free at the point of use. So that, and as you say, if you're not paying for a product, then in the end you are the product. So if you can afford an iPhone, for example, with end-to-end encryption, you have a measure of privacy. If you can't afford that, you can have a much cheaper phone in your pocket. But the quid pro quo is that if it's an Android phone, that all your data will be being harvested and being used. And part of the issue, of course, is the concentration of power, that these are just a very small number of companies that now control the internet in such a big way. And they're also very good at pulling the drawbridge up after them. If you think of both Facebook and Google, which are the two companies that are most addressed by Shoshana Zuboff, they were both startups. But now
so they thrived in an open environment where competition was allowed, but now they've closed down the competition so other people can't follow them.
Well, exactly. So what happens is that whenever a new startup company comes that shows any promise, either they try and close it down or they buy it up, so that they then own it. So there is a huge kind of agglomeration of power, which is in any society, knowledge is power, and if we give to too few people too much power over us, then there are ethical issues there.
Yeah. Now, just on the question about, as you said, walking past a shop and then you get an advert from this person, I was one of the pieces of information in the book I was absolutely stunned about was to see that people with Samsung TVs who with voice recognition on it were warned not to mention their bank details in front of the TV because it would be hoovered up. I mean, that seems extraordinary to me.
Well, an awful lot of people have no idea that that modern televisions come with a microphone built in as standard and a camera. But it also applies if you have Alexa in your home, and that's recording quietly the conversations in the background. Now, of course, the whole blurb is that it will be only triggered when you say the word Alexa, but but actually all that information is being fed through computers who are searching for keywords, and you
Now,
don't in the end know how much is actually being recorded
no,
about you.
we don't. Now, you don't touch on this in your booklet, and in fact, I didn't mention this to you when we were talking about what we chat about. But I can't help because this kind of overlaps with my area of interest, which is in the Book of Revelation. And of course, so I don't know what you think about this at all, but of course, I get regular emails most weeks of people saying to me that all this stuff about surveillance, of course, this is the mark of the beast, and we're all going to get tattoos or whatever so that you can't trade. Now, my immediate response is, well, actually, that's going down a rabbit hole, which doesn't actually help. I don't know if you've got a quick response to that kind of, in the sense that this pervasive exercise of surveillance and power is something that is unparalleled in human societies, isn't it? This is unprecedented.
I think it is. I think I've also come across a number of those things. I remember hearing about them in my youth group years ago. Kind of all there was a certain kind of evangelical kind of fear from America that I think was imported really into and I think that's partly why issues of power and democracy and freedom have always been interesting to me. And I've before I was ordained, I thought that God might be calling me into politics or something like that. So I think there are issues there, but so often when people come up with things that because they've read it, it's sufficiently shocking, it must be true, and actually they haven't really done the research. So that's partly why I really wanted to do some research on this. So that I was
yeah, indeed, and people really want to know what the mark of the beast is, they need to read my commentary, which happens to be just usefully just up here. So
yes.
Just by coincidence.
I see there's a bit of product placement going on.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there we go. So you are the product. Okay, well, let's move into the sort of theological products. I think what was really interesting about your booklet, if you want to wave it again, just so people can see it.
Yes,
there you are, the great booklet. That's what I hear about. But first of all, I mean, you raise in chapter 3 ethical issues, you're sort of moving in the way to a theological engagement, because as you say, I mean, it's interesting, there are quite a lot of secular critiques of this, but not so much reflection from a Christian point of view. And you mentioned a number of things, and it seems to me that the questions you raise are both, if you like, social ethical questions, but also personal ethical questions. So you talk about, and you've already hinted at this, you talk about the question of power and inequality, that these companies dominate and have huge control, and in fact are so big they're not even accountable to government on the one hand. On the other hand, you talk about these technologies being addictive. This is no accident. The social media companies deliberately want to hook us into this. One of the things I found incredibly irritating about Facebook recently is now they're dropping in these little short video reels. So I've made a New Year's resolution ahead of time to say I'm never going to click on one of those little video reels, because again, it just hooks you in and wants you to get attention. But also there's issues around power. There's issues around things being too big to contain. There's issues around consumerism and discontent. And you also mentioned surveillance communism. I mean, which of those, is it possible to say which of those you think are the most significant ethical issues before we actually step, as it were, into theology or are they things all related to one another?
Well, it depends who you are, really. If you're poor, then, or if you're black, then, or if you're a woman, then the whole way the internet is structured, because, for example, face recognition and algorithms tend to be developed, the software is all developed by young white men in Silicon Valley on the whole. And so one of the issues about the internet is that it discriminates, that's kind of built into the process. So, and as Christians, we ought to be having a bias for the poor and making sure that they have a voice rather than an internet which excludes. And of course, it does exclude also, because if you can't afford a nice expensive computer at home, you end up either using a library terminal or trying to do everything off your phone, where you get fewer choices and less opportunity to read the small print before you make transactions. So there are issues around the poor. I think there are big issues really around addiction, because, as you said, the whole internet is designed. I mean, there are highly paid executives in Silicon Valley whose whole job is to work out how to make us still be on the internet half an hour after we went to look up one piece of information. and we've all had that. No, that's fine if you're Ian Paul, because you ought to be able to make your own decisions. But that same level of sophistication is applied to problem gamblers, to promoting gambling, and the people behind the massive increase in online gambling know exactly the time of day when they're most likely to, if they put an advertisement in front of you, you're most likely to click on it if you have a gambling issue. And those adverts are particularly targeted at people with gambling issues because they're the most profitable ones. They're the ones who are most likely to throw their money away at this. So, which again is, we as Christians have a responsibility for those who are vulnerable in society, and not to play into their weaknesses.
Yeah,
I think.
I also just related to that. I heard recently, I just heard on the radio something that young people are often targeted because although they've got less money to dispose of, they're more easily parted from it, and of course then you're setting up habits for life as well.
Yes, that's true. But there's also the whole kind of democratic issue that, I mean, it is utterly incredible that the result of the Brexit referendum on the one hand and the last 2 or 3 presidential elections in the United States have been influenced, it's argued, by the very selective use of political advertising, which Mark Zuckerberg and others have spoken against. But of course, they've got no desire really, or no motive to cut down on the massive millions being spent on political advertising because it's one of their biggest revenue streams. But if you have a situation where micro-targeted advertisements can be sent to you because they know exactly your personal profile, they know exactly your spending habits, your allegiances, what you've said you like, by clicking on other people's likes, then it's very easy for the internet to then become an echo chamber which reinforces very often, I think, our worst selves rather than our better selves. And if there are 2 natures inside each of us, a spiritual nature and a human nature, I think there's a lot in the internet which actually really seeks to exploit and to make money from our human or our sinful nature. And we need to be aware of that misuse.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that we're quite often told that we shouldn't use the language of sin because people in our culture don't like it or don't understand it. And maybe it's true that the word sin itself is just sort of all doing something slightly naughty. But if you want to talk about flawed human nature, then I think you only have to look at the internet companies and say, well, they know all about that because they make the most of it.
But, well, and also the whole capitalism as a culture thrives on making us spend money that we can't really afford to buy things we don't really need, to impress people we don't really like. And that's actually a big problem for us as Christians, because if we're tending creation, then we need to be doing that in a way which looks after where we all live more gently in creation and we consume less. And yet the whole emphasis is of advertising is to persuade us to buy more, to consume more, that with another purchase we will finally achieve the happiness that we're looking for. I had a very devout mother who's long gone to glory, but I remember her teaching me that that contentment is not having what you want, but wanting what you have. And I was quite influenced by Jeremiah Burroughs's book, The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, a good old kind of a book of a previous century. And actually, if we could rediscover contentment, we've got a far greater chance of handing on this planet in a form where it will still be livable in by our children and grandchildren's generation, than if we succumb to the consumerism of our age.
Well, fascinating that you make connections between consumerism, between surveillance capitalism, and between the issue of the moment in terms of the health of the planet. But when we move into a bit more theological thinking, I was fascinated in chapter 4 of your Growth booklet that you introduced 2 ideas which were quite new to me, or the language was quite new to me. One was divine surveillance, and the other was the common gaze. Where do these ideas come from? What did you mean by them? Why is it that they carry theological weight, which is going to help us think through this issue?
Well, I was very struck by a book by Eric Stoddart,
Yeah.
who's an academic at St Andrews University, and he has written a book called The Common Gaze, Surveillance and the Common Good. And a couple of things really came out of that, which I wanted to explore. One is we so often hear people say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. If I've heard that once, I've heard it a million times, really. And he draws out the fact that on the one hand, we as Christians live under the loving gaze of God. And that is, so we ought to be more able than others to live transparent lives without anything to hide. And indeed, transparency is a good thing. But he also draws out the fact that there's a world of a difference between being surveyed by a loving God who knows all about me and longs for my well-being and my flourishing, and on the other hand, being surveyed by a company whose sole objective is to make money out of me and to use the information that they can glean from me, and who may in the process may well either leak that or sell that to other people, depending what happens and how trustworthy they are with that data. But there's also, he's really fascinating in terms of thinking about surveillance, because the surveillance of God is not from above. He actually talks about in this side of the Holocaust, really divine surveillance is God's vantage point from the cross, where he is surveyed in Christ, nailed to the cross. He is surveyed by everybody, and he looks on us with his wounded and naked gaze. And I think that's a very powerful image, really, rather than God as the eye in the sky, to think about. And he talks about, rather than surveillance, which is looking down, the divine view is one of conveillance, which is looking alongside. And I think that's a really helpful image for us to develop. And the challenge for us really is to live in the gaze of God, and in a way which brings life to others rather than uses information against them. And he defines the common gaze as God's looking over us with an inbuilt bias to the poor, which goes back to some of the things we talked before.
No, those are fascinating ideas, and we could unpack those even further. And I notice as well you talk about free will, that in the sense that God's gaze on us is never coercive in the way that, or intrusive in the way that the surveillance capitalism functions. But that leads on to the last part of your booklet. This is a Grove ethics booklet, so it suggests that there is something to be done out of this. This isn't just sort of idle theological speculation. And so you do in your last chapter talk about what can we do, because I think a lot of people feel that we are helpless. There's nothing we can do to resist this. But you offer three, I think, clusters of ideas. One is about regulation. The second is about resistance. And the third is about redemption. Can you say a little bit more about those, and again, how they spring from a Christian theological perspective on this issue?
Yes, I think I want to just say as a way into that, of course, I'm Archdeacon in Blackburn. Now, the two things about that, one is that as an Archdeacon, I'm in favour of surveillance, because part of my job is to keep an eye on 140 churches. And actually, churches do better when somebody is keeping an eye on them and making sure that they're doing the right thing. And one of the painful things, of course, we've learnt as a church is that when surveillance hasn't happened, we've made some shocking mistakes, and there are survivors from abuse who will bear testimony to that.
And in a sense, this is the root of episcopal language, isn't it? Because episcopate means oversight. It means keeping an eye on, as well as making things happen.
And the second part of being me is, of course, that I'm an Archdeacon in Blackburn. Now, Blackburn is one of the Lancashire cotton mill towns, which traces its proud history back to a time when 80% of the cotton on the world market was actually manufactured in Lancashire, or Greater Lancashire. Now, when industrialization came to Lancashire, there were those people who were really frightened of the new technology and opposed it and destroyed the looms, because they would put the mechanized looms because
Yes.
they would put people out of business.
Yeah.
And of course, that the Luddites didn't work.
No.
And we need to be careful not to be Christians against progress, the
Yeah.
kind of 21st century Luddites.
Yeah.
But the other reaction in the 19th century was, instead of trying to destroy the looms, was the Lord Shaftesbury, Octavia Hill, and all those who addressed the social evils that rampant industrialization had brought, and so brought in the Factory Acts, so that children would no longer have to work down the mines, so that children would have to go to school and couldn't be being sent as tiny little bodies between moving parts in order to clean them and whatever, and ending up being terribly injured in the process. So there is a part for Christians to press for regulation, and we really need to be pressing, just as actually Alan Smith, as Bishop of St Albans, is pressing on the whole area of regulation of gambling.
Yeah.
So we need to be having a much stronger voice in Parliament for regulation of the internet. But we also, there are things that we can do, that we can, so we can, besides regulation, resistance is about, well, interestingly, I mean, I've used Gmail for years, which is, of course, owned by Google. Now I realize that Google read all my emails or scan them all so that they can extract data from them. I've now gone on to Proton Mail, which is an email provider. There is a small subscription involved, but there is end-to-end encryption, and I think that small subscription is a price worth paying.
Yeah.
I don't use Google as my search engine now. I've set it to DuckDuckGo, and they are committed to never storing my search history or using it. Now, the result of that is that the search engine might be a little bit slower because it isn't able to use quite the store of information about my previous searches that others provide. But as on the whole, most smart devices are a lot smarter than I am. I don't mind if that's a few milliseconds slower.
No. And it's really interesting that those things are actually interrelated to one another. So actually, you know, in terms of redeeming, there's a sense in which regulation is a way at a social level we can redeem this. And then these acts of resistance are ways at a personal level we can redeem this as well. So that we are actually using this as a good gift from God rather than a tool for exploitation.
And that's where my third R comes, really. So regulate, resist, but also redeem. Because that's where the internet has massive potential for the gospel and for the spread of the good news, and that's why I want to continue to use things like Facebook, but in a responsible way, so that we're using it and using the internet for the gospel. Because most technological advances as you look in history, have been brought about by motivation either from a military motivation or from a spiritual motivation. And being able to print the Bible was a massive driver to the invention of the printing press. And so therefore, I want to say, well, let's use this incredible technology, which we've discovered the blessings of over the last, particularly over lockdown, when all sorts of people who are housebound or work on Sundays have now been able to engage with church, or have an unbelieving partner who doesn't really want them to go off on a Sunday morning. They've been able to engage with church and with God because of the ways we've been so creative in using technology. So let's redeem it and use it for good.
Mark, absolutely fascinating, and fascinating both to hear just the significance of the subject, but also how Christian ethical theological thinking brings to bear and actually can bring practical strategies and solutions to us. So wave the booklet to us again and tell people where can they buy it? They can come and visit you and you can sell them a copy.
Oh yes, well it's £3.95. It's available from Grove Books Limited, which are based in Cambridge. So I'm sure if you Google
grovebooks.co.uk, and it's post-free in the UK as well.
That's good. Interesting how I slipped in the word Google by mistake there. Other search engines are available. So if you put into your search engine, it won't be Google. If it's my search engine, it'll be a different one. As I said, I use DuckDuckGo. But put it into your search engine and you'll be able to find Grove Books and order it there. And why don't you order some for your friends? It will make a great present for them.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you very much and look forward to speaking to you again. Take care.
Thank you very much. Cheers, Ian. Bye-bye.